Hi, I'm Jim Ward of the Middle Country Public Library, and I'd like to welcome you to another episode in our History Bite series. Today we will discuss the Hampton Roads Conference, which was a meeting between President Abraham Lincoln and three Confederate officials where they discussed the possibility of negotiating an end to the American Civil War, which had begun almost 4 years earlier in April 1861. At this point in the war, Abraham Lincoln was desperate for peace. The American Civil War had raged on for almost 4 years, causing ruin to the country's economy, landscape, and psyche. With the death toll soaring well over 600,000 by now, the exhausted nation yearned for an end to the anguish. Lincoln visibly carried that same desire, along with all the stresses of the past 4 years, in his very being. He looked the way the country felt, war-weary. He wanted the war and the suffering to end. New York Tribune editor and abolitionist Horace Greeley provided the impetus for the Hampton Roads Conference when he contacted Francis Blair, an influential political figure and unofficial advisor to President Abraham Lincoln. After Greeley suggested that Blair was the right person to open discussions with the Confederates to end the war, Blair sought permission from Lincoln to meet with Confederate President Jefferson Davis and did so twice in January 1865. Blair recommended to Davis that an armistice be forged, and the two sides turned their attention to removing the French-supported regime of Maximilian in Mexico. This plan would help cool tensions between North and South by providing a common enemy, he believed. Meanwhile, the situation was becoming progressively worse for the Confederates in the winter of 1864 and 1865. In January, Union troops captured Fort Fisher and effectively closed Wilmington, North Carolina, the last major port open to blockade runners. Davis conferred with his vice president, Alexander Stephens, who recommended that a peace commission be appointed to explore a possible armistice. After Davis counterproposed a meeting between Generals Ulysses S. Grant and Robert E. Lee, and Lincoln rejected it, the Confederate president called Stephens, Senator Robert M. T. Hunter of Virginia, and Assistant Secretary of War John Campbell to a meeting on January 28th, in which he advised them of his intention to send them through the lines to meet with Lincoln. Davis made it clear, however, that they were not to agree to anything with Lincoln that involved reconstruction of the Federal Union. Davis sent Stephens, along with Hunter and Campbell, to meet with Lincoln at Hampton Roads. The meeting convened on February 3rd aboard the steamboat River Queen near Virginia's Fort Monroe in Hampton, Virginia. Lincoln and Stephens were reuniting after 16 years, when the two had been former Whig congressmen during Lincoln's one and only term in Washington, D.C. The group exchanged pleasantries and introductions and then got down to business. Lincoln made it clear that there were 2 points that were necessary in establishing peace. 1, Confederate armies needed to lay down their arms, and 2, Confederate states had to submit to the authority of the federal government. These demands were not negotiable, but once they were met, much else would be possible. This included the manner in which slavery would end. Lincoln told the group that the war had made emancipation a foregone conclusion. He said, quote, "Slavery must be abolished," end quote, adding that the black soldier had only reinforced his strong belief in emancipation. However, he offered a gentler way for the Southerners to ease out of the institution of slavery: compensated emancipation. He was willing to discuss the possibility of the federal government paying slave owners for their enslaved people. This, coupled with the announcement made by Seward that Congress had just submitted the 13th Amendment to the states for ratification, gave the Confederates much to process. Lincoln pledged to the Confederates that he would be generous in restoring Southern property taken under the Confiscation Act. He was revisiting compensated emancipation, something that he had always supported and something that he unsuccessfully attempted to use to end the war in the summer of 1861. Seward openly disagreed with this offer, saying that the United States, quote, had already done enough in expending so much money on the war for the abolition of slavery, end quote. Seward paced the floor in anxious disapproval, while Lincoln reasoned that both sides carried some responsibility for slavery. He went on to add the details of a plan where half of a proposed $400 million package would be distributed to southern states in proportion to their slave population by April 1st, if all resistance to national authority had ceased. The other half would be made payable by July 1st if the 13th Amendment was ratified by then. Stevens sidetracked the conversation by presenting an outlandish plan that would temporarily engage both sides, buy some time, and allow everyone an opportunity to cool off. He suggested that the Northern and Southern armies join forces and attempt to drive the French out of Mexico. Hunter openly disagreed with this idea, saying that the South was in no position to take on another war. Lincoln shut it down completely, sticking firm to his stance that nothing would happen until the Confederacy pledged to the ultimate restoration of the Union. But ultimately, after less than 5 hours of the meeting, the three Confederate representatives could not agree to the first two non-negotiable conditions of peace, so nothing of note was achieved between the five leaders, despite the surprising offer made to them by Lincoln. But Lincoln pursued the concept in a specially scheduled cabinet meeting on the evening of February 5th. Here he defended his plan for compensated emancipation as a measure of strict and simple economy. He wanted to send it to Congress for consideration. After some discussion, the cabinet voted against the idea, saying the rebels would mistake the offer as a, quote, sign of Northern weakness and war weariness, end quote, which could infuse a new energy into their war efforts. They felt strongly that the only way to effectually end the war was by force of arms. Lincoln was disappointed, saying, quote, "You are all against me." He noted later that he had drawn up papers that were submitted to the cabinet and unanimously disapproved by them. Lincoln reported to Congress that the Hampton Roads Peace Conference ended without result. The Civil War would continue for another 2 months, effectively ending when Robert E. Lee surrendered to Ulysses S. Grant at Appomattox Courthouse, Virginia, on April 9, 1865. Thank you for joining us for today's episode. If you enjoyed it, click like, and if you watched on YouTube, hit subscribe. Thanks so much, and we'll see you all next time.